All right, let's cross now live to Daniel Shaw, Latin American Studies professor at New York City University, joining us live right now. Daniel, I'm glad to have you join me. So what is your reaction to Trump's words? What kind of so-called friendly takeover is he talking about?
Greetings, Mike. I just returned from Cuba within the last 72 hours. The situation on the island for the 10.5 million people of Cuba is extremely dire. All food, oil, gas, electricity, transportation is not functioning. It's a complete economic paralysis, to quote the Cuban government. It is a campaign of economic genocide. For Trump to call this somehow a friendly takeover is ridiculous. This constitutes a 67-year war on Cuban sovereignty. Nothing could be more hostile. Friendly for Marco Rubio and the Miami Cubans who want to take over and see this island as theirs, not friendly for the 10.5 million people of Cuba, subjected now to the zenith or the apex of this hunger campaign, which really began in 1990 with the special period.
Now, do you think Cuba should take these words as a threat or a warning, especially after we saw what happened in Venezuela? And how should it respond?
Well, we just saw the incursion, the raid into Cuba from Miami of a speedboat with armed criminals trying to take over Cuba. So the attacks are coming from every direction. The Cuban people can't take anymore. The Cuban people want to be able to eat. They want to access food. The oil blockade, the 37 years of a special period have provoked the worst forms of inflation. You still have the MIPYMES, that's the Spanish Cuban abbreviation for these private stores and private entrepreneurship. And Trump and Marco Rubio, their plan is to buttress the private sector. So there's a parallel economy, but the everyday Cuban people can't access these private stores because the prices are dollarized. So you have massive inflation where they can't access food at all. This it calls for humanitarian intervention because every flotilla that goes there, the U.S. has been blocking them from delivering much needed supplies to the 10.5 million people of Cuba, and decreasing because people have been forced to leave Cuba, and people have been forced to, well, because of malnutrition. Many Cubans have already left us because of starvation and malnutrition.
Now, Trump's also added that Washington and Cuba are engaged in talks. Now, what is the subject of these negotiations and what could they lead to?
They're trying to negotiate through their fifth column. That's this burgeoning, but I think already stabilized capitalist class within Cuba that own these MIPYMES, because I waited for hours and hours with the Cuban population for some type of transportation and it never came. But then you see a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz flying by you on the highway. You see these private stores, they are well stocked. There's plenty of food. They have their generators, they have their gas and oil and alcohol and whatever they need. It's the 95% of Cuba. I think this constitutes an ongoing war on the masses of Cuba, and it's a type of capitalist natural selection. Those that have family in Madrid or in Miami will survive, and many other families will perish and are perishing. That was my experience being on the ground in Cuba for almost the last 2 weeks.
Now, Washington has for decades had a grip on the country with harsh sanctions and an embargo. So what is the end game here for the United States?
The end game, whether it's Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, is a complete colonial takeover, that the Cuban tourist industry, that Cuban resources would be drained by U.S. and Western capital. The U.S. has a $30 trillion economy. Cuba's GDP last year was in the range of $300 billion, and that has shrank incredibly this year because all of the tourism has been cut off. I witnessed the final Canadians and the final Germans and Italians leaving Cuba. So the war on Cuba rages forward. They have weakened and made the Cuban people more hungry and vulnerable than ever, so that now they can go into full colonial takeover mode. This has been their goal since 1959, and they've never forgiven the Cuban people because they were able to stand up and say Cuba for the masses of Cuba, and they kicked out foreign investors who were running the economy prior to the 1959 revolution.
Now, Cuba is known as the place in history which almost led to nuclear confrontations between the United States and former Soviet Union. So how dangerous are these talks of any kind of takeover of the country?
Well, a lot of Cubans say if Fidel Castro was alive, we'd take care of everything. But Fidel Castro had the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and the Warsaw Pact countries. Today, Cuba is extremely isolated. Trump claims somehow that Hezbollah and Hamas have a presence in Cuba. That's beyond ridiculous. What threat we see right now, Cuban doctors being kicked out of Honduras and other countries by these neoliberal regimes. What threat could anyone ever seriously say that Cuba represents? Cuba's number one export has always been medicine and nurses and doctors and internationalism. And that's why Washington is hell-bent on ensuring that there's no sovereign star in the sky for any of the nations of the world to see. And that's why they want to stamp out the example of the 1959 Cuban Revolution.
All right. Now, we have to leave you here now. Daniel Shaw, Latin American Studies professor at New York City University. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mike.